and welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today I'm going to talk about writing autistic characters because I was asked to talk about the things I'd like to see in autistic characters in the media. And I do have opinions about this, but first I do want to say, of course, that my own preferences with regards to autistic characters in media and stuff aren't necessarily those of all autistic people. I'm just one person, but I do have some thoughts on this. So I think for me the most important thing, or one of the most important things when writing autistic characters, is to include actual autistic people in the process. You know, if it's for something that's going to be on television, maybe try to have an autistic person do the acting, try to have autistic people involved in the process of acting, writing, directing, not like every step necessarily, but try to include autistic people at some point in the process. Because if something is going to be about autistic people and you want it to be good representation, it only makes sense to actually include the people that you're trying to represent. And related to that point, the parents of autistic people might be a useful resource, but they do not replace including actual autistic people, because as much as they may have specific types of knowledge, the parents of autistic people, if they aren't autistic, aren't autistic. And that's not a substitute for including actual autistic people in your work. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about some of the more specific areas here. So I think for me it's important that a piece of media owns the fact that the character is autistic. You know, and I'm not saying that the character has to be specifically mentioned as autistic in universe, because I know that that's not always reasonable. You know, you might be setting your story in a particular world or a particular situation where it doesn't make sense for the character to be explicitly mentioned as autistic. But if you can do that, I think it's great. And if you can't, I still think that the character should be specifically owned as autistic in social media and when you talk about the story to the people who are watching, because it shows that you're not trying to pull the sort of ambiguously disordered trope, which is very common, and you're not trying to make the character weird enough that you can use them as humor, but not in a way that makes you actually have to do the work to show them as autistic. Because I feel like in some situations, Big Bang Theory, they make a character very intentionally implied to be autistic, but go out of their way to denounce the fact that said character is probably autistic as a way of denouncing responsibility for the way they portray the character. And I would advise strongly against doing that, which is why I would recommend that even if you can't say in canon this character is autistic, you say it outside of canon, if possible. And it is possible to have a character be ambiguously disordered in a way that works, but to do that, I think you have to be clear that it's not just something you're using for humor, that you're actually taking it seriously, even if the piece itself is intended to be humorous. So, for example, in the show Community, Abed is specifically mentioned outside of the work itself as being autistic. And in fact, I believe the writer or director, or I'm not too sure about all those fancy roles in television, but Dan Harmon, I think, discovered that he was autistic while writing Abed. So that's a good example of having an autistic person involved in the process. And he is mentioned, I think, specifically as autistic, at least at one point outside of canon, and it's implied a few times in canon. However, he doesn't really get any specific diagnosis in canon that's actually emphasized and given to him officially. And because in the show, I guess spoilers a little bit, in the show a couple of times he's shown as hallucinating or having delusions, which is not an autistic trait. So he's probably dealing with some other sort of an ambiguous comorbid disorder as well, which, although used in situations that can be humorous, because the show is intentionally humorous in many parts, they also treat the things that Abed deals with seriously and show them as being relevant to his character and his character development, and are not something that he's only ever mocked for at the expense of his personhood. So if you're going to make a character ambiguously disordered, I guess just, think about how that affects the character and the people around the character and how everything interacts and fits itself together. Don't just do it because you think that it will be less work, I guess. So now that I've gotten those two pieces out of the way, let's talk about how to actually show that your character is autistic. So I think, obviously autistic people can be very different from one another, and autistic traits don't always just manifest in the same ways. Some autistic people are very loud, some are very quiet. Everybody has different sensory preferences and ways of manifesting their special interests and ways of socializing with other people. And because of this variety, there is no one right way to have an autistic character be autistic. And in fact, I would say that it's very important to show that autistic people can be different from one another. If you have more than one autistic character in your story, that's a great way to show that you know that not all autistic people are the same, because they can have different traits and show that they're autistic in different ways that sort of bounce off of each other. And I think that can be a really good way of doing that. If you can't have more than one autistic character in your story, but you're writing multiple different stories with different autistic characters in them, that can be another way of doing that. In addition to that, I think it's important to consider the diversity of the people who you're showing as autistic, because in addition to the diversity of autistic traits that exist in the world, autistic people ourselves are diverse and varied in a lot of other ways that aren't specifically related to being autistic. A lot of existing autistic characters are pretty much exclusively cishet white men who are able-bodied. So showing autistic characters who are women or non-binary or people of color or physically disabled or LGBT or, combinations thereof is important, because it helps to really cement the fact that autistic people aren't just isolated from the rest of human diversity. And that's something that the media is still sort of struggling with, I think, in terms of showing autistic people. And in fact, the comment that prompted me to do this video specifically mentioned the difficulty with finding good resources on autistic women, because due to various social factors, autistic women are less likely to be noticed as autistic. So that's something that definitely is still a struggle as far as representation goes. So I don't think there's any set of tips and tricks for how to actually show a character's autistic traits. I think really the most important part is just to be respectful of the fact that the autistic character is a person. I mean, obviously not a real person because it's a fictional character, but within that universe that you're writing, your autistic character is just as much a person as the other people in your story, and they should get just as much depth and likability and thought as all of your other characters get. Don't make them more or less two-dimensional than your other characters. And I think this tends to be something that happens especially in shows that are intended to be humorous, where it becomes very easy to make the autistic character the source of humor specifically and solely because of that character's autistic traits. And they don't get any recognition of their identity as a person beyond being laughed at. And again, I might be making subtle comments about the Big Bang Theory here. Basically just don't do what they did. And again, if you're autistic and you did relate to Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory, I'm not saying that that's wrong or bad, but the writers really didn't do a good job of being respectful towards a character who is pretty clearly autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, even if they don't want to own up to that fact. And this is really more about what the writers did wrong. than about relating to the character as an autistic person. So yeah, just be respectful of the fact your character is a person, and make them likable if they're intended to be likable. You know, I mean, not every autistic character has to be a likable person. Autistic characters can be villains too, and villains can be likable, heroes can be not likable, you know, etc. But don't try not to make them dull because you read that autistic people have monotonous voices and that means that your character should be boring. Like, you know, try not to make those sorts of mental leaps there. And in addition to all of this, just try to, I think, stay away from implying that the autistic character is inherently inferior to the other characters. Even if in the plot line, in the canon material, they don't receive respect and recognition as a person, even if they're dealing with a lot of ableism, I think it's important for the context and framing of that ableism to be such that it's clear that those things are wrong. And that can be tricky to do, but I think it's important to make sure that you're not letting characters get away with doing hurtful things to the disabled character, or implying that the character is wrong or inferior or bad because they're disabled, without also making sure that the audience can reasonably tell that that's wrong. This doesn't mean that every character who is ableist has to be punished or has to die a horrible death or anything like that. It's a lot more subtle than that, I think, and it's about the narrative framing of what happens in a story. And that can be tricky and subtle, and there's also a degree of, you know, how recognizable can it be? How much can I assume that my audience knows or doesn't know? And, you know, I'm not a professional writer, so I can't really get into the details of that, but I think it's something that's worth thinking about anyways when you frame your story. So that's a lot of what I'd had to talk about here. So I'm going to talk about some examples as well of characters that I think were done well or poorly, but keep in mind that a lot of the pieces of media that have autistic people in them aren't from genres that I'm super into. And I guess this is another point. You know, your autistic characters don't have to just be in that one type of show that's specifically about them being autistic in the real world that really exists. You know, autistic characters can be in fantasy and sci-fi and horror or action. We can be in other genres than like that one genre that all of the autistic characters are in. So some of the examples that I'm going to be talking about here are maybe a little more like coding or less explicit, just because I'm not really into the genre that like The Good Doctor is, which is like medical drama. Like stuff like that isn't necessarily my personal favorite to watch. I'm really more into fantasy sci-fi, and I'm not saying that the other genres are bad, I just don't like them as much personally. I find them less interesting. So anyways, I have heard good things about The Good Doctor. I have not watched it, but I've heard that it was pretty good from autistic people. I've heard Atypical was bad. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of why it's good or bad for things I haven't watched because I haven't watched them, but there are reviews online by autistic people talking about how they felt about these pieces of media. I've heard good things about Please Stand By, which I do intend to watch at some point because it has Star Trek in it. And I've heard good things about the Power Rangers movie, which I also intend to watch, partly just for nostalgia, because I really liked that when I was a kid. I've already talked about how I don't like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory because I feel like the writers went with the route that prevented them from having to put any real work into respecting his character. And I've talked about how I think Abed was actually a pretty good character. He's not the most 100% accurate, but there are some elements of accuracy there that I think were fairly subtle and that I liked. I think at one point they mention Abed dealing with prosopagnosia, which they don't mention by name, but they do have a reference in one episode to how he mostly tells people apart by their hair color, which I liked. It was a nice subtle thing. They have a few other subtle things, like there's some episodes where they show him stimming with various items. He talks about how he really hates the sound of people chewing gum, I think. Stuff like that. And there's some little details that I think showed that they did put some work into his character. And I also appreciated that there was an autistic person involved in the creation of his character at one point. So those are some elements there. And off the top of my head at this exact moment, I'm not thinking of any other autistic characters from TV shows or movies that I liked or didn't like. I can think of a lot of characters that were coded as autistic, but not explicitly autistic, but I'm going to save that for a different video. Because I feel like there is a difference between characters that were intentionally written to be autistic and characters that weren't, but are commonly read to be autistic anyway. So that wraps up this video, and I hope that you found something of value in it, and that you can consider these things if you're writing or thinking about writing an autistic character. And once again, just remember that, I'm one person, and these are my thoughts on the matter, but there are other people with other thoughts as well. But most important points: include autistic people in the process, treat your characters with respect and as characters, and try to own the fact that they're autistic, even if you can't do that in the work itself. And just remember the diversity between autistic people and autistic traits, and also the fact that autistic people are also, part of the broader human diversity. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great day.